Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we'll be talking about Chapter 7, Business Government Relations. Let's go ahead and get started. So there are seven key learning objectives here in Chapter 7. First one is understanding why sometimes governments and businesses collaborate and often other times work in opposition to each other. We'll talk about some cases where they collaborate, like in the Facebook situation at the present moment, and what sometimes they work in opposition, as in recently Tesla has worked in opposition with the government. The second business objective is defining public policy and the elements of public policy process. Some of you will go into public policy. It's a super interesting field, a field all of its own. So this is a little introduction as to how that works. The third objective is explaining the reasons for regulation. Why would the government want to regulate anything in the business world? The fourth is knowing the major types of business regulation, government regulation of business. So how can governments regulate businesses? Fifth is identifying the purpose of antitrust laws and the remedies that may be imposed. Six is comparing the costs and benefits of regulation for business and society, right? Does regulation make sense? Does it not make sense? Obviously, this depends on the situation. And then the last one is examining the conditions that affect the regulation of business in a global context. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first one here is how business and government relate. So the first, the case study that we're going to be talking about that you might want to keep in the back of your mind that we'll be reviewing in class is the Facebook case, right? And so the privacy regulations were really put underneath the microscope in 2018. This is when Europe decided that Facebook was really going out too far by allowing advertisers to obtain private information about the Facebook users. So they cracked down on Mark Zuckerberg and had him appear in Brussels and talk to them about what he's going to do to change the regulations or to change the rules about how companies can access that data within his company. So keep that in mind as we go through these points from this chapter. The first thing about how businesses and governments relate is seeking a collaborative partnership. So when they're working together, right, this is a good situation. Government cooperates with business for mutually beneficial goals, and they're influenced by the nation's values and their customs. Like the book mentioned that both Asia and Europe are very more family oriented than we are here in the US. And so because they are family oriented in their customs, that comes into the business context so that businesses feel that the government are like their family, that they work together to make society better as a whole. Here in the US, that's not necessarily the case. So here in the US, sometimes there's more about businesses working in opposition to the government, right? And the main point here is that government's goals and businesses' objectives are in a conflict and results in an adversarial relationship, right? And so this is what I was just mentioning at the beginning of this chapter, that Tesla had this issue recently where they withdrew from working with the government because they felt that the government was too slow and that their investigations were going to take too much time and that they were not going to have then the opportunity to tell their side of the story. And the story happened was when, someone was killed in one of their semi-automated cars, and that the government wanted to come in and regulate this and was blaming it on Tesla, that they needed regulation. And Tesla said, wait, it's not the full story. We need to explain what exactly the situation was in that particular car, in that particular programming of that, of how that car, that driver handled that situation. So Tesla said, forget it, government, we're not going to work with you because you're not giving us the opportunity to voice our opinion on the story. So we could spend more time going to this case study, but the idea is that Tesla was initially working with the government to create some regulations on self-driving cars, but then because the government was too slow and bureaucratic, Tesla said, because they are so nimble, right, as we know, they were going to go on and not connect with the government and create regulations. They were going to go on and do their own thing. So then we walk into legitimacy issues. So this is where companies operating globally may find governments whose legitimacy or right to be in power is questioned. And a really great example is where the US imposed strict regulations for US companies not to work with or invest in South Africa in the 1970s, because at the time, South Africa was heavily involved in apartheid, right? And they were implementing racial segregation. And the US said that they don't approve of such things. And so they wanted all US companies to stop interaction with South Africa. And that was actually quite effective. Eventually, South Africa said that this is not possible, because not only the US was imposing these regulations on their organizations, but many, many countries around the world. So again, this is how businesses and governments can relate in many different ways. Let's get into the details as how those things come together. The government's public policy role. So public policy, as I just mentioned, can be a very interesting topic. Public policy is a plan of action undertaken by government officials to achieve some broad purpose affecting a substantial segment of a nation's citizens. Public policy sets the goals, plans, and actions that each national government follows in achieving its purpose. So the point here being is that generally governments don't act unless a substantial segment of the public is affected, right? So they're not going to go and say, you need to, stop surfing, because that is not an issue. But they are going to come in and say, you need to stop texting while you're driving, because that's putting people at risk, right? A lot of people go to graduate school just to study public policy. I have a cousin who she's up in Northern California, spending 2 years in her master's degree on just environmental public policy. And she's most likely going to go to Washington after graduate school to work either in the government or with some NGO to help create more policy to help the environment. So let's go ahead and hop into the next slide, because these are the elements of public policy here. The first one being public policy inputs. And we're going to talk about this a lot in our case study with Facebook in class. So I take notes if you haven't started already. Public policy inputs here are external pressures that shape a government's policy decisions and strategies to address problems. This is otherwise known as growing recognition of the situation, and in our case of people who are driving while texting. So they're saying that we're aware that more and more people are distracted drivers, and thus people are being put at risk, right? And why I think this is such a good example of distracted drivers is because teens, especially, are greatly vulnerable to this, right? They've found, research has shown that a good portion of the accidents that happen with distracted drivers happen to teens. So since you all are recently teenagers, I thought this would be a good example to work with as we go through and talk about public policy. So again, the inputs, the external pressures, right? That people are saying people are getting hurt because people are driving while distracted. Then we're going to talk about public policy goals. These can be broad or high-minded or narrow and self-serving. So what does that mean? So this is what we're addressing is what goals are being served by this action. For example, the distracted driving ones, the goal is to prevent harm, right? And so that one is pretty broad, right? So someone is going to create a public policy that says you can't drive while holding a cell phone in order to reduce the amount of harm to other people on the road. Public policy tools, these are incentives and penalties that the government uses to achieve these policy goals, right? And so, as we've seen in the last 3 years, since 2018, many states have implemented, they've banned cell phone use except for with a hands-free device, right? So that's the actual tool and the incentive that they're putting into place to help this policy. And then the public policy effects, the outcomes arising from government regulation. These can be intended or unintended. But the idea in this example is that the number of deaths will drop, hopefully, which it has, due to less distracted drivers. Let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. We're going to be talking about two types of public policy. There's economic and then there's social. Economic is the bigger one. So let's get into that first. And this, after we talk about those two, that'll be at the end of part one of this chapter, the first half. So economic policies are broken down into fiscal and monetary, and then on the next slide, trade policy. So let's talk about fiscal policy first. These terms are probably quite familiar from your economics classes. So fiscal policy is the patterns of government collecting and spending funds to stimulate or support the economy, right? And so this is how we spend money. The government spends money on collecting our trash. Okay, we pay for a portion of trash, but they pay for a good portion or even a majority of our trash pickup. They also the government pays for the public schools, right? We pay the taxes, but then the government pays for the public schools. So that's an example of how government spends money on a regular basis. Where we see this exaggerated is when the government wants to stimulate the economy. And the best example that I always like to think of is during the Great Depression, right? That President Roosevelt, he put into the system a huge amount of public works projects, right? New bridges, new buildings, new roads, etc. So now he was spending on creating better infrastructure. And the whole idea was that it would employ more people because the economy was under such a Great Depression, literally, that there were no jobs, there wasn't money circulating, the market was down, was heavily, down in a very bad way. So by spending money in public works, it put more money into the system and brought the economy back. Obviously, then World War II came too, which greatly improved the economy, but that's a whole other story. So the idea is that when we spend money by the government, that it stimulates or supports the economy. So the next one is monetary policy. And this is where policies that affect the supply, demand, and value of a nation's currency. So again, this is really keyed into your economics course. This is how it affects the country's buying power of money, the stabilization and the value of savings, and overall the confidence of the citizens, right? So when the dollar is strong, then the American citizens are confident in their economy. This also affects the ability of a country to borrow money and attract capital, right? So if the United States wants to borrow money from, say, China, they have more ability to do that when the policies create environments to make that happen. Also attracting capital and playing with the interest rate as well. So you see that the Fed, right, can increase and decrease the interest rate, and that's monetary policy that will encourage borrowing or lending or less borrowing and less lending, et cetera. And so you see this today, actually. I'm probably going to date this video, but Biden, right, he's trying to increase the debt ceiling. So this is going to be a monetary policy. So he wants to increase the debt ceiling. He wants to take out more money from the government. And the Republicans are saying that this is not a good monetary policy, that for the United States to have too much debt, it puts us into a very vulnerable position. So we will see what happens with that. But that is a really good example of what monetary policy is all about. Let's go on to the next slide. Here we have taxation policy, raising or lowering taxes on businesses or individuals, which is pretty straightforward, hopefully. Industrial policy, this is directing economic resources toward the development of specific industries. So when I think of the auto industry, right, that right now the auto industry, Detroit, is not doing all that great, right? That in the past couple of decades, the auto industry in the US has not been so successful, and Detroit as a city has really plummeted. And so Detroit gets now a lot of government spending, like government money to help sustain the industry and to help keep the city of Detroit in a more stable way, stable position. And the last one here is trade policy. This is encouraging or discouraging trade with other countries. And personally, this is one of my favorites because I studied international business. And so a lot of my colleagues in international business school, they focused on trade policy. And then after graduation, they went into creating a lot of public policy for trade. And an example here is where in 2018, right, Trump created a lot of tariffs, especially with China, because he just felt like China was getting too powerful, and that China was imposing a lot of tariffs on the U.S. and it just wasn't fair that we didn't impose many tariffs on the Chinese products, and we were letting them free flow right into the United States, and then the U.S. products were not competitive anymore because, right, the China products can be made so cheaply and there's no tax on them coming in. So then the US products and the US business owners were having a hard time keeping up. So Trump thought that it was smart to support US businesses by imposing tariffs for the Chinese products. That has created a whole domino effect, right? Because there's a theory now that the Chinese are really angry about this, and one of the reasons why they did not want Trump to be reelected. But the idea is that by creating trade policy, we can really, control our relationship with other countries. Great. And so the next slide is about the types of public policy that are called social public policy. And this is a little, I'd say, simpler at first glance. The idea, because there's really just one major bullet point here. These are policies that can turn social services for the citizens, right? This is all about low income housing or services for veterans, etc. So we focus on this as well in this chapter, but in business school, we focus more on the economic pieces of public policy. Great, so that is the first half of chapter 7. I look forward to seeing you for the second half.